Speak to John Lyndon, the executive director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Hello to you, John. Thank you for speaking to Paris Direct this Sunday. Before we came on the air in the past hour, we have had a couple of statements. Hamas says it's still keen on reaching a comprehensive statement, but Israel's Binyamin Netanyahu saying he cannot accept Hamas's demands to end the war and leave Hamas in power. How far apart are we from finding a ceasefire deal?
It's very difficult to tell because I think both sides are practicing some pretty obvious brinksmanship and also different interpretations around some kind of constructive ambiguity about what a ceasefire may or may not mean. It's very clear that Hamas is demanding an end to the war, and that Prime Minister Netanyahu, has said that just this afternoon, in fact, that is an unacceptable demand, and that he would see that as being commensurate with surrender. And I think if you look at the sort of leaked and reported on contours of any deal, the ambiguity begins to become a little bit clearer. We're talking about several phases, perhaps 3 phases, where at the very end, which could be 100 days from the signature of the deal, the talks around the permanent withdrawal of the IDF would take place. Now, it's sort of in the eye of the beholder about whether or not that means a ceasefire. It certainly isn't immediate with regards to a withdrawal of Israeli troops. And I believe those details, if they're correct, should provide enough for both Hamas and the government of Israel to be able to sort of claim some kind of qualified victory and to bring the violence that we've been seeing escalating again in the last 24 hours to an end.
Yeah, and that would be phase 3, if I understand correctly. Does that mean phase 1 and phase 2 are taken care of?
No, I think it's all or nothing. So we know that in the first sort of phase of this, we're talking about again, there's different interpretations, but I've heard 33 hostages being released, 1,000 Palestinian prisoners being released, and a cessation of violence for that period. Now, we haven't had anything like that since back in November. And just as a change in the current dynamic, those 16 days or so will be extraordinary for the people in Gaza, for the access of humanitarian aid, obviously, to be able to disrupt the growing concerns around famine that you spoke about earlier. And then obviously for families of hostages to be reunited with their loved ones after more than 200 days of captivity. It's hard to overstate how disruptive that would be. And I think it would create, hopefully, the conditions for those second 2 phases to be implemented, and the prospect of ever returning to the kind of violence that we've seen would hopefully become less and less imaginable as politics begin to take over.
Another concern is Gaza's most southern city of Rafah, where over 1 million Gazans have been sheltering for some time. A lot of concern that regardless of what plays out in Cairo, that Israel will be moving forward with an assault on Rafah, and Hamas concerned about that, wanting to lean on the U.S. to try to persuade Israel not to do that. How do you think that plays out?
My hope is that this is part of a strategy of pressure. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu said over the weekend, I think embarrassing Secretary Blinken, who was traveling in the region, that there would be a Rafah operation with or without a deal. Now, if you zoom out and think about that, that's an impossibility. The idea that Hamas would sign on to a deal, regardless of its terms, if they knew that an operation with Rafah was happening regardless. So it's again hard to square that sort of rhetoric with what we understand is taking place today in Cairo. And I think all of Israel's friends around the world, literally all of them, have been very clear about the unacceptability of an operation in Rafah. For many of them, full stop, and for others, such as the United States, without preparations taken in order to look after the well-being of the more than 1 million Palestinian refugees at this stage in Rafah, without that being brought to the fore. And I've heard from sources in Washington that they still haven't seen any plans that would adequately take care of that humanitarian catastrophe that we would see in Rafah if an operation took place. The other part of this is the Egyptians. You need to understand these talks are taking place in Cairo, rely upon Egyptian support and facilitation, and the Egyptians are very, very alarmed. This would bring Israeli forces right up to the border with the state of Egypt. We've never seen an operation like this at the border with Egypt since there has been a peace deal between Egypt and Israel, and deconfliction mechanisms to avoid some kind of an incident between the Egyptian and Israeli military would be necessary. And even with those mechanisms, you really can't discount the possibility of an accident that would have extraordinary ramifications for the region.
In any war, the control of information is vital to either side. This Sunday, reports that Israel has decided to shut down Al Jazeera's offices in Israel. What do you make of that?
This has been sort of discussed at cabinet level and within the Israeli media for a couple of months now, and it's very hard not to understand it within the context of everything we just spoke about. So Qatar, alongside Egypt, are the core sort of facilitators for these negotiations that are taking place. Qatar is obviously where the Hamas leadership is currently residing, and I think this has probably got a lot more to do with these negotiations and pressure or some sort of message being sent to Qatar than it has to do with Al Jazeera as a television network. That would be my assumption. It's hard to know exactly what's trying to be communicated, though. The Qataris in recent days have said that they would be, reports were at least seen that Qatar would be willing to expel Hamas if they weren't willing to accept a deal that was on the table. And I suspect some of this is pressure, perhaps coordinated with the United States and others, on Qatar to try and ensure they can bridge some sort of proposal and pressurize and force Hamas to accept a deal that's on the table.
One final question on the humanitarian level. This Sunday, an interview is going to be airing in America on Meet the Press. The head of the World Food Program saying famine has finally arrived to northern Gaza. If that isn't the case, because we've been hearing these warnings for months now, just how urgent is this situation to get a ceasefire deal and aid access improved? Just how urgent is that?
It's incredibly urgent. And if you look at the warnings we've been hearing for a long time, they have been saying May. So there, again, there's complex mechanisms and formula for calculating this, but people have predicted that sort of May was the time when famine conditions may be met. And it's very hard to know until it's retrospective that you are in famine. And once you are, it has a momentum, a deadly, devastating momentum all of its own. And so anything to be done to disrupt that, to get food and basic humanitarian supplies into Gaza needs to be the forefront of everybody's thinking right now. And even if we manage to get the ceasefire today and flood the Gaza Strip with aid, there are still huge developmental consequences for the lack of food for particularly the youngest Palestinians over the last 7 months now, that they'll be living with the legacy of this for their lives. So I think this should go above politics. And I think it's notable that you see Cindy McCain, somebody who comes from a storied Republican family, very, very strong support for the state of Israel, now heading the World Food Program, making this warning directly on US network television. It should be, again, beyond politics, beyond pro-Israel, pro-Palestine. This is about safeguarding human life.
John, thank you very much for speaking to us this Sunday. John Lyndon from the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Thank you.